Well, today we are going to be tackling, today I think we're going to be tackling one of the most difficult things as believers in America that we face. We're going to be tackling and looking at the idea of self-reliance. We're going to be looking at self-deception and perception. And the reason why I say that I think that is one of the most difficult things as believers that we face in America is because just as the Corinthians had allowed pride to puff themselves up and let self-deception blind them and comfort numb them, I think if we're honest with ourselves, the temptation isn't just this ancient temptation, it is alive in us today, especially in Americans. Because as Americans, we are raised to value our worth, and our worth is measured by our productivity and our independence. And if we're honest with each other, it is easy for us, even for us faithful believers, coming to church every Sunday to start measuring success by the amount of comfort we have, or comparison instead of by the cross. And if it's easy for us to fall into that trap, there are probably some here today that didn't even know that it was a trap. Paul, in this section of Corinthians, is writing to remind the Corinthians and us that the Christian life is not defined by crowns and applause, but by humility, dependence, and faithfulness. This morning, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians 4, 6 through 13. So if you have your Bibles with you, I'd encourage you to turn there. And we are continuing our series through Corinthians called Church Recalibrated. It gives us a look at how the church must return to God's original design and rhythm. And last week, we saw in verses 1 through 5, what matters most in ministry isn't about applause, it's about faithfulness. And this week, Paul is going to press deeper into that theme. He is going to show us that the only way to stay faithful is to stay what I'm calling cross-shaped. The moment we drift from the cross, we end up losing our reality. This morning, so we're going to be looking at how Paul shows us three ways the cross restructures our reality. The first is that the cross humbles our pride. Second, it reverses our values. And third, it reveals that God's glory is in our weakness. And each of these confronts the church in Corinth, and I think us, and our natural drift toward pride, toward comfort, toward self-sufficiency. So we're going to read 1 Corinthians 4, 6 through 13 together. If you wouldn't mind standing for the Word of God, we'll read it. I've applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against another. For who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. And would that you did reign, so that we might share the rule with you. For I think that God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels, and to men. For we are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise for Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. To the present hour, we hunger and thirst. We are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we blessed. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world, the refuse of all things. You may be seated. I want us to look at how the cross humbles the proud. And we see this in the first two verses, in verses 6 through 7. Paul turns the mirror back toward the church in Corinth, and he's saying, look at me and look at Apollos. We're examples of how to stay grounded. His goal here is not to shame them, but to realign their perspective, to humble them back to the truth of the gospel. He begins with this phrase, I have applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit. In other words, he's saying, let me use our lives as living illustrations for you. And the next line here is key, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written. And what that phrase means is don't drift beyond the boundaries of Scripture. The Corinthians had started treating opinion and charisma as measures of spirituality. They had elevated human wisdom over God's wisdom, which is honestly pretty easy for us to do. In fact, I would argue that the majority of us do this without even realizing it. And the news that we watch, in the podcasts that we listen to, the books that we read, the people we listen to, how often are we really weighing what they are saying against the message of the cross? Paul says that this attitude, this position, this practice has made them puffed up. The Greek word here, physio, literally means to inflate. And I want you to think of a balloon. It looks big, but it's nothing. It's full of nothing but hot air. And that hot air is pride. It looks impressive when blown up, right? I was blowing up a balloon yesterday for my kids, and I blew it up huge for them. I mean, it was like this big, and all of my kids were like, whoa, that's a huge balloon. It looked impressive, but it had no weight to it. It was fragile. It was easy to burst, and it was completely dependent on what was filling it. And Paul gives these 3 rapid-fire questions, I think, that pops this balloon of pride that is going on in the church of Corinth, and I think can sometimes creep itself into the church. He says, who sees anything different in you? What do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? He's reminding them and us that everything that we have is in grace, that everything we have is found in grace. Every gift, every skill, every opportunity that we have received, it's not achieved. See, pride forgets that. Pride assumes the credit for what grace has given. And the answer here to those 3 questions that Paul is asking the Corinthians, the answers that Paul is looking for when he says, who sees anything different in you? He's saying no one. No one sees anything different in you. And what did you have that you did not receive? He's saying you received nothing. Or you did not have anything. You had nothing that you did not receive. And then he asks, if then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? And there is no reason to boast. I want us to think of it this way: the moment that we think that we have arrived spiritually as a believer, as a church body, the needle of reality comes really close and it'll pop our balloon. Because pride always leads to a deflation. So Paul's message, I think, is really simple here, and it's piercing to us that the cross humbles the proud and that it deflates this illusion of self-sufficiency. The Corinthians had started believing in their own press, as we like to say. They thought that their success and spiritual gifts made them superior. And Paul says, no, the cross reminds you that everything that you have, even your spiritual maturity, is grace. And at the foot of the cross, there is no room for boasting because the cross levels the ground. This truth is as true for us as it was for Corinth. This church has seen God do incredible things over its 64-year history. It's seen families who have come to know the Lord. It's seen baptisms. It's seen missional engagement. But if we're not careful, we can start to believe that that is because of us, something that we have done. Pride can start whispering that we did it. Our guidance, our wisdom, our programs, our tradition, we did that. We even have to be careful about it now in this season of revitalization, that we might have a temptation to say, hey, we turned a corner, that we're getting healthy, that we did it. And that's the reason why Paul says, don't go beyond what is written. And what he means by that is don't leave the place of grace. Don't leave the place of grace, because everything that's happened in your spiritual life, everything that has happened in my spiritual life, everything that happens in the life of the church is a gift from God. It has nothing to do with us and what we have done. It is a gift because we are recipients, not originators. The moment we forget that, we start building on the wrong foundation. And I was reminded of that just this last week. I spent a few days down in Irving, Texas at the Acts 29 conference, and it was a gathering all about church planning and gospel mission. But there was a theme that kept surfacing over and over and over again in all of the speakers, and it wasn't about strategy or structure in a church. It was about prayer. It was about prayer. Pastor after pastor said the same thing over and over again, that we don't need more cleverness in the church. We need more dependence. We need to recognize that it is God doing the work in the world. It is God doing the work in our lives. It is God doing the work in the church, and it is not us. That we don't own it. It is His. We don't share in any ownership of His church because it is His bride. We are stewards of His church. And everything that we have is a gift from our Master. John Piper has a quote that says, "For most of us, the voice of self-reliance is 10 times louder than the bell that tolls for the hours of prayer." And that hit me hard because one of our core values here at Bethel is prayerful dependence. And see, it's not meant to be just a slogan that we throw out there and say, hey, one of our core values is prayerful dependence. Look at how holy we are, right? Because prayerful dependence is a necessity. Without prayer, we're just busy. Without dependence, we're just noisy. But with prayer, even weakness can become strength. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, prayer is one of those things that we oftentimes forget about. Sure, we might say prayer at meal times and before we go to bed, but how often are you seeking the Lord throughout the day for guidance? How often are you bringing him troubles? How often, and I'm saying this to myself, how often am I praying and seeking his guidance? How often am I seeking his dependence? How often am I kneeling down before the God of the universe and saying, God, I can't do any of this because everything I touch is going to be sin-stained. And so I need you to come in here, and I need you to lead. I need you to guide. I need you to do the work. I think if we're honest with ourselves, John Piper's quote rings true in each one of our hearts, that self-reliance is 10 times louder in our life than the bell that tolls for the hours of prayer in our life. Another thing that was consistently discussed, and maybe you've been paying attention to it, but maybe not, maybe this is news to you, is that God is moving right now. There is a movement of God that is happening right now. That 5 years ago, if you had asked preachers and churches and pastors and church leaders if they saw coming, they would say, "Ain't no way," because people are dropping out of church. Culture is diminishing across the board, and yet, in the last 2 years, even culture is recognizing it. It was pointed out that over 50 articles in the last 12 months through secular news sources have reported worldwide how Gen Z is coming back to faith, is flocking back to the church, is actively seeking God. And God is moving right now so much that even the world is wondering what is happening. Because hearts are hungry for the Spirit of God again. And you can see it. You can see it online. You can see it on campuses. You can see it everywhere, that hearts are hungry for the Spirit of God. In fact, Maverick was up here, right? We had Maverick, who is a missionary to the college campus at Washburn University here in town through Christian Challenge. Maverick was up here, and during his talk last week, and maybe you noticed this, during his talk, he kept talking about how they keep breaking records of how many engagements they've had from students this year. How big Christian challenges, right? They had been meeting for years in a space. And just this year, they had outgrown it because so many students had begun to come to Christian Challenge, they had to go to a bigger auditorium. They had the most ever students attend their conference. They had the most ever students sign up to go on mission trips, so much they had to increase the amount of missions trips they were having threefold because the younger generation is hungry and eager for the Spirit of God again. And to be honest, I don't want Bethel to sit on the sidelines and watch it unfold on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. I want us to be right in the middle of it as a church. Here in Topeka, if it is God's will, not for recognition, but because we are desperate for him, because we are desperate to be a part of his mission. And that desperation leads us to maybe do some crazy things for him. And here's a gut punch. Proud people don't pray. Self-sufficient people, self-sufficient churches don't seek God in prayer, much less revival. But when God's people humble themselves, when they say, Lord, everything we have, everything we received is yours, and we just want to be a part of what you're doing. Use us in whatever way you want. That's when heaven starts to move. Faithfulness, we talked about this last week, that faithfulness always precedes gospel movement. You see, the cross humbles us so that prayer becomes possible again. Let's say that again. The cross humbles us so that prayer becomes possible again in our lives. It reminds us that every victory that we have received is received. It's just that. It's not achieved by us. Every blessing is borrowed, not owned. And that's where Paul is going to take us next. Because once pride is deflated and our perspective begins to change and shift, we begin to see that the cross doesn't just humble us, it completely flips our understanding of what success looks like. The Corinthians weren't reaching for the crown, they were pretending like they already had it. And we're going to see how the cross reverses our values here in verses 8 through 10. Where it says, already you have all that you want. Already you have become rich. Without us, you have become kings. And would that you did reign so that we might share the rule with you. For I think God has exhibited us apostles as last of all, like men sentenced to death, because we have become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake, but you are wise in Christ. We are weak, but you are strong. You are held in honor, but we in disrepute. You see, verses 8 through 10 is one of the reasons why I know that there is a spiritual gift of sarcasm. Because if verses 6 through 7 deflates pride, verses 8 through 10 exposes pride and how it distorts our values, because Paul's tone here turns sharply to sarcasm and irony. He uses sarcasm and irony to demonstrate how pride distorts our values. He says, you already have all that you want. Already you have become rich. And without us, you have become kings. And here's the deal. He's not commending them. He is cutting through their delusion with sarcasm. Because they weren't hoping to reign, right? There wasn't a future hope of reigning. They were already acting. The church was already acting as if they already did. Their pride had created a false sense of arrival. They believed that they were spiritually mature, that they were wise, that they were powerful, and even though their attitudes and their divisions proved otherwise, they were acting in a way that they had already arrived. And so Paul, in his sarcasm, he said, man, you have already arrived. You are already kings. It's what scholars affectionately call an over-realized eschatology. Eschatology being the study of the end times, the worldview of the end times. You see, the church in Corinth was living as if the glory of the future kingdom has already fully arrived, while ignoring that the cross still defines the present. And I think this is something that the church in America, not just Bethel, can struggle with. I think sometimes because of the riches and the wealth and the comfort that we have and the knowledge that is accessible to us and the freedom that we share and the ease of being able to read the Bible and the expansive amount of information that is available to us about the scriptures, we can act as if we have arrived, right? We are already reigning. We are already reigning. We have already become the kings. We are reigning alongside Christ. And Paul says, you think you are reigning, but the reality is that you are still called to suffer. That we have not got to the reigning part yet. This is the struggle with the already not yet. This is the struggle with the already not yet. We are co-heirs. We are saved. We are justified. And yet we still are present in a sin-filled, corrupted, broken world. And we are called to be missionaries to that world. And this comes right before, I think, the sharpest contrast that Paul makes here. He says, you are reigning, you have what you want, you have become rich, you are kings. And he says, but we are fools for Christ. You are wise and we are weak. You are strong and you are honored, but we are despised. Do you hear it? They believe maturity meant respect, power, and influence. How many here in this room can often have that viewpoint? That maturity, spiritual maturity means respect, power, and influence. But Paul says the opposite is true. That the apostles are the spectacle. They are the fools. They are the rejected ones. Here's Paul's point here. The church in Corinth, they weren't reaching for the crown like we are called to do. They were pretending they already had it. They weren't reaching for the crown. They were pretending they already had it. They were living as though the Christian life was about ruling instead of serving, about comfort instead of the cross. Their pride had not just inflated them, it had inverted their reality, and their perception was off. The cross, Paul says, reverses all of that. That in God's kingdom, wisdom looks like foolishness, strength looks like weakness, glory comes through humility. And the very things Corinth admired, eloquence, charisma, wealth, recognition, were the things that Paul counted as loss for Christ's sake. The cross, therefore, turns every human value upside down. And here's the risk. Here's the risk that we run if we're doing that. Has anybody heard of stolen valor before? So there's this idea where I think this Veterans Day is coming up on November 11th, and I think this is a good reminder to us. Stolen valor is this idea that a person will go out and they'll go buy a military uniform and they'll put a rank and insignias and medals on it, and they'll go wear it, and they'll try and get discounts or people to thank them and stuff, and having never served in the military before. It's a very serious thing. In fact, it is illegal to do, but still many people do it. And I want you to imagine someone wearing these medals for service they never did, for battles they never fought in. And that's what self-sufficiency in Christianity looks like. That's what self-sufficiency in Christianity looks like. It's wearing the symbols of victory while avoiding the struggle that gives them meaning. And Paul wants to shake them, and I think us, and awaken us to that reality. And church, this isn't just a Corinthian problem. This is our temptation too. Because here's the truth. We can talk about missions all day long. We had an entire month talking about missions. We can give toward missions. And we can celebrate missionaries. And still, we can never actually participate in the mission ourselves. Somewhere along the way, we've started confusing supporting the work of the gospel with doing the work of the gospel. Don't misunderstand me, please. Don't misunderstand me. Giving to missions matters. We should give generously and joyfully toward missions and supporting missionaries who are going out and doing that work. Because we see it in passages like Philippians 4, where Paul thanks the church for sharing in his trouble and calls their gift a fragrant offering and an acceptable sacrifice and pleasing to God. And I want to stand before you next week and say, not only did we meet the goal for Faith Promise, but we exceeded it. Giving is important. But at the same time, I want us to understand that writing a check is not the same as carrying a cross. Sitting in a comfortable chair and funding the work is not the same thing as joining in the work. We see in 2 Corinthians 5 that Paul exhorts the church that every Christian is a minister of reconciliation. Every member of the church is an ambassador for Christ. There was and there is no category for passive supporters. Paul never envisioned a church as spectators funding the work of a few or several missionaries. His call is that churches should embody the gospel by multiplying disciples and sending others to do the same. It is the same call. It is the same reason why I stand up here and have stood up here several times and saying, I am not called to do all of the work of the church. Y'all give to the church, and that giving does provide me a salary, and I am so thankful for it. It helps support me and my family, and we are grateful for it. But at the same time, it does not dismiss the responsibility for you as believers to be out doing the work of ministry, visiting the sick, counseling, helping the poor, helping the orphans and the widows, building ministry that reaches people for the lost, sharing the gospel with your neighbors, with your coworkers, with random people that you meet. That's why I think this next year's mission trip matters so much to me, and I think it matters to the church, because this is, in a lot of ways, this is not just a trip. It's a chance for Bethel to step back into what we've been talking about. It's a way to get some spiritual skin in the game. It's to move from theory to actual practice, from comfort to compassion. And that's why also my heart is stirred for this church to participate in church planning. Because I don't want Bethel just to admire the Great Commission. I want us to live it. I want us to send people. I want us to plant churches. I want to see disciples made, not just fund medals, but win some ourselves. The cross calls us off the sidelines. It calls us to stop applauding from the stands and start joining in the game. And that's where Paul takes us next. Because when you actually get into the game, and you want to follow Jesus into the real gospel work, you find that the Christian life isn't glamorous, it's rather gritty. It's full of scars and sacrifice. And I remember when I first wanted to and was deciding to try and get into ministry, one of the pastors I talked to said, do whatever you can else other than ministry, because ministry is hard. Doing the gospel work is hard. And it comes with scars and sacrifices. And I think that's why so many people shy away from it, because they look at that and they say, man, I really like my comfort. And that is going to make me uncomfortable. And so maybe I'm just going to let that go to the pastor to do that. Or I'm going to let somebody else take that opportunity. And Paul exhorts, he says, don't let somebody else get your crown. It is in the grittiness, it is in the scars and the sacrifice that is where the glory of God shines the brightest, though. In verses 11 through 13, we're going to see how Paul shows us that the cross doesn't just humble us or reverse our values, but it reveals that God's glory is right in the middle of our weakness. 11 through 13 says, to the present hour we hunger and thirst, we are poorly dressed and buffeted and homeless, and we labor, working with our own hands. When reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. We have become and are still like the scum of the world and the refuse of all things. Paul drops the sarcasm here. The irony fades, and his tone turns raw and real in this moment. He contrasted the Corinthians' imagined kingship with the apostles' reality. And he is going to describe for us now how and what faithful ministry actually looks like. He says, to this present hour, we hunger and thirst. This is not poetic language. It's literal. The apostles were often hungry, poorly clothed, and homeless. They weren't living like royalty. They were living like servants of a crucified king. And Paul adds here, we labor working with our own hands. And that phrase would have shocked the church in Corinth, because in their culture, manual labor was beneath the dignity of philosophers or leaders. But Paul is saying we work with our hands because that's what love does. It serves. He continues, when reviled, we bless. When persecuted, we endure. When slandered, we entreat. I want you to notice the pattern here, that it's all a reversal. The natural response to rejection is retaliation. But the apostles' response is grace. They absorb hostility and return kindness. Why? Because that's what the cross teaches us to do. And when Paul ends with the two most humbling words in this section of Scripture, that we have become the scum of the world and the refuse of all things, the Greek words here are vivid pictures. There's two words that are used, parakathamata and pararipsima. Both refer to scraps that are left over after cleansing, trash, waste, filth. In the ancient world, these words are oftentimes used to describe the final sweepings of a sacrificial ritual of what was thrown away after purification. And Paul is saying that is how the world sees us. We are throwaways. But in God's eyes, these so-called throwaways are trophies of grace. And I think that is where the perception oftentimes gets mistaken, because we live in a culture where man, that's oftentimes the world doesn't see us that way. And so we can begin to believe it and begin to, in our heads, get puffed up. And here's the point. The cross reveals God's glory most clearly through weakness. When the world sees shame, God sees honor. When the world sees loss, God sees loves. The apostles' suffering here is not a sign of failure. It is the stage where God displays his power. The church in Corinth thought that glory was found in comfort and in status. And we see it so often that is often the things that we chase, both personally and corporately. Comfort and status. But Paul says it is that glory is found instead in endurance and in faithfulness. The church doesn't advance through applause, it advances through perseverance. And this is where I think the message turns home to us. The church, we need to remember that the call to follow Jesus is not a call to comfort, but the call to cruciformity, to be shaped like a cross, like the cross. The apostles didn't just preach the gospel, they embodied it. They lived out what they proclaimed. And that's what God is calling Bethel to do. What is God calling me to do? What is God is calling you to do? That our community doesn't just need another church that looks powerful or looks good from the outside. It needs a church that looks like Jesus, that is humble, that is sacrificial, that is willing to serve even when it costs something. The fact is, the city of Topeka does not need more religious consumers. It needs more gospel carriers. It needs people who will walk across the street, who will show compassion, who will open their homes, who will share their faith and be willing to be misunderstood and be willing to be rejected for Christ's sake. And this is what it means to take up the cross. It means to love God, to love people, and to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Because that mission statement is not a slogan, it's a lifestyle. It's saying that God, if the world calls me a fool for following you, I will take that name gladly. Because the cross-shaped life may look like a loss to the world, but in reality, it's the only life that truly reflects the glory of God. And when you serve quietly, when you forgive deeply, when you love those who don't love back, you are displaying the gospel more powerfully than any platform or program ever could. And the beauty of it all is that the world calls this refuse, and God calls it redeemed. God turns our weakness into our witness. The cross humbles our pride, it reverses our values, and reveals God's glory through our weakness. And as Paul closes this section, we are left with a question. I think, what kind of church will we be? What kind of church do we want to be? Do we want to be a crown-wearing church or a cross-carrying church? The Corinthians mistook spiritual success for spiritual maturity. Their perception was one of self-reliance and self-deception. The cross is not just the entry point into the Christian life, It is the place that we launch from to find great success. It is the pattern of the Christian life. The cross humbles our pride so that we remember that everything is received and not achieved. It reminds us of our dependence on God and calls us to be in prayer. It reverses our values so that we can stop confusing comfort with calling, and it reveals God's glory through our weakness so that the world sees Jesus and not us. And church, this is, I think, what God is inviting Bethel into, a season of surrender, a rhythm of faithfulness, not of crowns, but of crosses. Because I don't want us to sit in comfortable chairs and applaud from a distance while others carry the weight of gospel work. I want us to step into it. I want us to pray dependently as a church. I want us to serve faithfully. I want us to go boldly across the street, across the city, across the world, because Jesus is worth it. And church, this week, laying down your crown might look like giving someone else the credit at work. It might be starting your days on your knees instead of on your phone. It might mean that taking up your cross might look like showing up to serve when you'd rather sit at home. Forgiving the person who hurt you, or signing up to go on the missions trip instead of just giving toward missions. But still, please give toward missions. Let's stop watching ministry happen and start living it. One humble, obedient step at a time. Because that's how a cross-shaped church, I believe, makes the gospel visible to a city like Topeka. Let's pray.